Welcome to Fahrenheit 451, Lesson 8, Using Parallel Structure and Adverbial Phrases in Writing. We've been drafting narratives with a flashback. Today, we will analyze how a writer uses parallel structure in a text. We will analyze how a writer uses adverbial phrases to convey meaning in a text. Then we will revise our writing to include parallel structure and adverbial phrases. You will need Chapter 7 from Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave by Frederick Douglass. This was back in Lesson 4. The Joy of Reading and Writing, Superman and Me by Sherman Alexie, back from Lesson 1. Your draft narrative from the previous lesson, and the Mentor Sentences handout from this lesson. Analyzing a writer's craft is similar to analyzing how an author makes meaning, which is a critical skill for the cold read task. Using parallel structure and adverbial phrases build writing skills necessary for the culminating writing task and the essay and speech in the extension task. I want you to reread paragraph 7 from The Joy of Reading and Writing, Superman and Me by Sherman Alexie and respond to the questions in the handout, in other words, the Mentor Sentences handout. Then we're going to conduct a whole class discussion in response to the questions on the slide. And those questions are: what patterns do you notice in this paragraph? How does this pattern impact the meaning in the paragraph? How does this pattern influence the reader? So now, let's discuss. The paragraph on this slide is a draft narrative. Let's read through this paragraph. When I was in kindergarten, we learned the letters of the alphabet, but we did not learn to read. At some point in the spring, a teacher pulled me and a few of my classmates out of our regular classroom and led us down the tiled hallway, through the auditorium, past the front office and the nurse's office, and finally to a room off the main hallway that I had never even known existed. In the room was a long table with chairs and an easel with white-lined poster paper. We sat down. We waited. The teacher, Mrs. A, brought out a book, but this wasn't a normal book. This book seemed as tall as I was at the time. Mrs. A propped the book on the easel. She opened the book to the first page. I think it had a mouse on it. And then we began to learn to read. So I'm going to look at this paragraph and think about ways that I could add in parallel sentence structure. What idea or detail do I want to emphasize in this paragraph? I really want to focus in on the process of learning to read, like Alexie did, and I want to emphasize that it is important we did it as a group, together, since this made us feel like we were special or getting a special treat. The treat in this case, learning to read. So, what words or phrases should repeat to emphasize this idea or detail? I could add to the paragraph where it currently ends. I could repeat the word we to emphasize the group dynamic, and then I could make each sentence a part of the reading process. So it could be revised to be, and then we began to learn to read. We saw the black print. We connected it to a letter from the alphabet. We learned the sound. We put the sounds together. We read the words. We kept going. We were learning to read. So now I want you to pull up your draft narrative, and I want you to revise your writing to include parallel sentence structure. And remember to use these questions, just as I did, to guide your revision. What idea or detail do I want to emphasize in the paragraph? What word or phrases should be repeated to emphasize this idea or detail? I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to make your revisions. So now let's look at a passage from Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass. I have had her rush up at me with a face made all up of fury and snatch from me in a newspaper in a manner that fully revealed her apprehension. She was an apt woman, and a little experience soon demonstrated, to her satisfaction, that education and slavery were incompatible with each other. Now, on your handout, your mentor sentences handout, I want you to respond to the questions on the slide. What do the highlighted phrases describe? What impact do they have on the reader? And now, let's discuss. What do those phrases on the previous slide that were bolded have in common? They were adverbial phrases. They were prepositional phrases that functioned as adverbs. Now, adverbial phrases modify information and ideas in a meaningful way. Remember that an adverb modifies a verb. It can also modify other adjectives and adverbs, but for right now we're focusing in on how it modifies a verb. And it answers the questions how, why, when, and where. It's called a phrase because it doesn't have a subject and a verb pairing. Adverbial phrases begin with prepositions or infinitives and answer the same questions as an adverb. So in other words, how, why, when, and where. So looking back at that same passage from Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, why are the highlighted phrases adverbial phrases? Who can tell me why they are, based on that previous slide's information? So now we return back to that previous model narrative draft. And we're going to try to add in adverbial phrases. We're going to try to revise the draft to include adverbial phrases. So as I'm doing this, I want to think about a few questions, just as I did with the parallel sentence structure. First, are there any verbs that I want to describe in more detail? I notice that in the middle of the paragraph, the sentences get really short. I originally did this on purpose, thinking about how Alexi used short sentences in the paragraph we studied. But now I'm thinking that I could add more detail to the verbs in these two sentences. We sat down, we waited. So what phrase that begins with a preposition or an infinitive could I add to describe this verb? In other words, sat and waited. I could revise these sentences in the following ways. We sat down in confused silence. In confused silence is the adverbial phrase because it begins with a preposition and describes how we sat. It also gives more insight into the mind of the writer. We waited with our breath held. With our breath held is the adverbial phrase because it begins with a preposition and describes how we waited. Again, giving a little bit more insight into what happened that day in the writer's mind. So just as before, I want you to revise your narrative draft to include adverbial phrases. And just as I did on the previous slide with my example, I want you to use these questions to guide your revision. First, are there any verbs that I want to describe in more detail? Second, what phrase that begins with a preposition or an infinitive could I add to describe this verb? For the purpose of this assignment, I want you to add in at least 2 adverbial phrases to your narrative draft. I'm going to give you about 10 minutes to do so. Our Let's express our understanding slide is actually going to be for homework. Attached to this lesson is a video tutorial for Flipgrid. I don't know if anybody in here has ever used Flipgrid before, but I'm attaching the tutorial in case you haven't, including how to log in and everything else. I want you to create a video in Flipgrid tonight, sharing your revised draft. Before you share it, I want you to answer these 3 questions. Does your draft have a flashback that sets up a problem or situation? If not, how could it be revised? Does your draft use parallel structure? If not, where could it be added? Does your draft include adverbial phrases? If not, where could it be added? Once you have finished your recording, you're going to turn it in using the turn-in feature in this lesson. As shown on the Flipgrid tutorial. Congratulations! You have now completed Lesson 8 of the Fahrenheit 451 unit. In this lesson, you analyzed how writers use parallel structure and adverbial phrases. You also practiced incorporating parallel structure and adverbial phrases in your own writing.